The Key to the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks. Chapter 8. A Different Tribe. The following weekend was fixed on for the preliminary camping trip. There was no reason at all now why Guion should be excluded, and Omri had the decency, through his bad mood, to be glad of that anyway. It would have been necessary, but mean, to scheme to keep Guion at home if they had been going. So their mother packed them all sorts of food and drink, and they put the old tent and their grotty old school trip sleeping bags, and their dad borrowed Adielle's, into the trunk of the Ford. They put on ratty clothes and piled washing things and spare sneakers and underclothes and sweaters ready to stuff into a big rucksack their mother promised to produce from somewhere. And produce it she did, triumphantly shaking the dust and spiders of age off it in the yard. A huge, heavy thing adorned with numerous pockets, buckles, and cracked leather straps. It's been among my family stuff for years. I found all sorts of strange things in it. An old solar toppy and some really lovely old stuff from India. Omri fingered it. It was very old indeed, and looked as if it must be about to fall apart, but when he tested it by pulling hard on the straps, nothing gave. They made them to last in those days, his mum said approvingly. What's a solar topi? A pith helmet. Omri looked blank. I'll show you. Follow me. Omri gave the knapsack to Guion, who stood in the yard with it dangling from his hands, as if Omri had dumped a dead dog in his arms, staring at it with incredulous disgust, and followed her into the big barn that had once been used for pigs. A room at the end was filled with his mum's family stuff. She picked up an old cotton bag and lifted out of it one of those thick sun-stopping hats that explorers in the tropics used to wear. It, like the knapsack, looked old and none too clean. It even had some spots of paint on the brim, but still usable. It must have been your grandfather's, Omri said. Matt's, yes it was. All the stuff from India is his. She picked up a strange thing like 5 upside-down bowls made of bronze engraved with dragons, with a cord going through the middle of them. Attached by a rotting piece of string was a stick. His mother held them up and struck them one by one. They made a pleasant bell-like sound, each a little higher than the last, till the smallest bowl at the bottom made a final musical ping. Why don't you hang that indoors, Mum? It's nice. Okay, I'd forgotten I even had it till I looked in the knapsack. Was there anything else in there? Yes, quite a lot. It's all wrapped up, but I opened this. Look. She took some yellowing tissue paper off a tiny statuette of a black elephant about 2 inches high. Ebony, she said, with ivory tusks. Isn't he sweet? Here, you have him. Thanks, Mum. Omri took it from her and put it into his pocket, thinking he would stand it on one of the shelves in his room. Did you know you had all this? Well, yes and no. I remember some of it. Granny Marie used to let me play with some of the things when I was a little girl. There were more elephants then. They stood in a line on the mantelpiece, biggest first, smallest last. Maybe they're all here somewhere. I really must go through all this stuff one day. And this gong thing hung in the hall, and everyone who came in the house wanted to have a go with it. You'd hear it chiming faintly and know someone who'd slipped out of the room and sneaked into the hall to try it out. Only very old and stuffy people resisted. Granny used to call it her young-at-heart chimes. The weather was quite warm for October, but on Dartmoor it might well be different. You never knew. Very bleak, Dartmoor, said their dad. They managed to fit all their extra clothes, except rubber boots and anoraks, into the big knapsack. Guion thought it was revolting and said he'd be ashamed to be seen with it. If only we'd had time to order some new stuff. Oh, well. When we do the real trip with Ad, we'll have a decent nylon one. Let's go somewhere where there's nobody but us, Dad. They'll think we're paupers or something carrying a lump of old junk like this around. Nevertheless, he put the knapsack in the back seat, which he'd bagged because he always fell asleep on car journeys, and, despite his disgust, he wanted to use it to lean against. That suited Omri, who far preferred to sit up front. At long last, it was nearly noon by the time they were finally ready. Their mother kissed them all through the various windows, and then ran off because she thought she heard the phone ringing from across the lane. Ready, boys? Right. We're off. And their dad put the key in the ignition and switched on the engine. The next moment, Omri wasn't in the car anymore. He had the most extraordinary, jiggling, jumping sensation. He seemed to be being pulled from his head, from his hands. Even his feet were being lifted and dropped to a strange rhythm. He was dancing, but not of his own free will. Someone or something was making him dance. His eyes, which a moment before had been looking through the windshield of the car into the deeply shadowed back of the parking bay, were suddenly blinded by bright lights, so that he screwed them shut. But his body kept up this senseless rhythm, his arms and legs flying, his head bobbing. And now he could hear voices, squawking music like a tinny horn, loud, strange voices, but most clearly of all, a drum beat, quite close to him. It was drumming out the rhythm he was dancing to. He was terribly shocked and frightened, but he had to see what was happening. He opened his squeezed-shut eyes a crack, and then wider. An amazing scene met his eyes. He was out in the open air, hot air, blazing with sunlight. Before him was a colorful crowd of people, women, men, children, most of them staring at him. They were brown people, with black hair. Many of the men wore turbans and baggy clothes. The women wore saris. Omri knew a sari when he saw one. They brought just one word into his addled, aching head. India. India. Indians. What had happened? Could the magic make a mistake, like a person, take him back to the wrong Indians? The notion was so bizarre that if he hadn't been so completely shocked and scared, he would have burst out laughing. The thought only lasted a nanosecond, and after that, for a while, his brain simply refused to function. All he knew was that he mustn't show these staring people that he was alive. The forcible pulling and dropping of his limbs and head went on, to the throbbing of the drum and the tooting of the music. He let himself stay limp and just tried to orient himself. Something kept moving and dangling in front of him. He saw it was strings, 2 of them. He followed them downward with his eyes, and saw that they were attached to the cloth above his knees, and that these strings that were pulling his legs up, it was these strings that were pulling his legs up and down in the dance. As his knees were lifted up, he saw that his legs were covered in bags of bright purple silk. He swiveled his eyes to the side, and thought he heard a surprised gasp from the people who were grouped in front. Watching, he turned his head a little to the left. His arm was in a sleeve, a full sleeve of red and gold material. There was a string around his wrist that kept up steady pulling and releasing, making his arm move. He felt his head jerked till it faced forward. Then he felt himself being moved on the spot. He was being made to dance to the left, then back to the right. He could have resisted, but he dared not, because he knew now not only where he was, but what he was. He was a marionette. He'd brought a string puppet to life. But how? How? Jerking on the ends of the string, his head on fire with pain. He tried to think, but it didn't make any sense. Even when he had been part of Little Bear's teepee, and the Algonquin warriors had been attacking the village and threatening to set the teepee on fire, Omri had not been more frightened than he was now. At least then he had had some vague idea of what was happening and where he was. He'd known that Boone and Bright Stars were somewhere close at hand. He'd known that Patrick was at the other end. But he knew what to do, that he could bring him back if only he turned the key in time. But this was different. This was a trip he hadn't planned or prepared himself for. Besides, he was in pain. The string for his head was fixed on his hair. Every time that string was jerked, pain ran all over his head, so that he wanted to shout out, but he mustn't. He did the only thing he could, apart from holding his head up. He went limp and let the puppet master dance him around. His thoughts were fuzzy with fear. He mustn't give himself away. That was all he knew. That one eye movement had nearly done it. Some of the audience had noticed that he turned his eyes like someone alive. He started to the front and let his body be jiggled and jerked, and just let the fear wash through him. The music ended. The strings made him fall forward into a bow. The audience clapped and shouted. The head string agonizingly pulled him upright, and then he saw somebody pushing through the crowd, coming to stand in front of the low wooden stage, a big smiling white man in a khaki safari suit with a what was it called? A solar topee on his head. He said something in a language Omri couldn't understand. It was something approving, praising. Then he put out his hands and took the strings above Omri's head away from the puppeteer. There was a lot of laughter and interest in the crowd, which was gathering around now. Some dark-skinned little boys, wearing only white claws wrapped around their hips and legs, were trying to touch Omri and stroke him, but the big man held him high out of reach of their hands and laughed, and seemed to tell them not to touch. Omri had to force his eyes to stay wide open, but as soon as he was above eye level of the children, he was able to blink and close them for a moment against the glare of the frizzling heat. He heard the clink of money. He risked a quick peek. He saw what must be the puppeteer, a big man in a turban and bright showman's clothes, bowing and smiling through his black beard. A huge hand came and fondled Omri, and the man said some words Omri guessed were some kind of fond farewell. He realized that he had been sold to the white man in the solar topee. The solar topee. As the white man moved away, still holding Omri up by the strings high above his head, of the children who followed, laughing and reaching up their hands to touch and grab him, he was dangling just level with the big man's head. The solar topee had a mark at the top of its brim that he recognized. He had seen it only a short while before, just before he had been dragged back through time, white dots, as if some small spots of paint had fallen on it. Then he knew who this white man who had bought him from the puppet master was. It was Matt, his own great-grandfather. And that's the end of Chapter 8.